Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 to 9. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As men moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the men were building. The Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it is called Babel. It was called Babel because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. Well, I guess many of you will have been to France and maybe seen the Eiffel Tower before. But I was very interested to learn about the Eiffel Tower from a magazine article recently. A lot of the interesting things that are not so well known. This tower, which was opened in 1899 at the World Fair held in Paris by Gustave Eiffel, the man who designed it in 1889, I should say, sorry. It is a massive tower, of course, in the capital of Paris. And everybody knows it as a landmark, but I wonder if everybody knows some of the hidden facts about the building. For instance, it has 1,665 stairs. What a march that was to get to the top when that opened the first time. Today, it has 120 antennae on it. And that has nearly 50 miles of electric cables that cover the whole structure. It has to be painted continually to stop the rust, and it's been painted different colours from red and yellow as well as bronze. About halfway up, it has an apartment built inside it, which Eiffel built for himself. It was a luxury apartment in the middle. And on the top, it has a science lab, which was originally used for him to carry out experiments from. And during the war, I believe Hitler wanted to use it for radio mast and so forth. It has 20,000 light bulbs illuminating the landmark every single night. And there was something else as well, but I've forgotten, so maybe that's enough. But I was fascinated to read that because I couldn't help thinking, there's something that everybody knows about, but they don't really know about it. There was all sorts of things in that article that I'd never heard of before, even though I've known about the Eiffel Tower all my life. Well, this morning we're looking at the Tower of Babel. And the Tower of Babel is one of those things that I guess most people have heard about it. And if you've been in church, if you've grown up in Sunday school, you've certainly heard about it. But I wonder how many Christians today really understand about the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11 and the amazing significance of this tower for the whole of the Bible and for our lives today. And so as we're studying the book of Genesis, and we're at this juncture now, as we come to the end of what's called the seedbed of the Bible. Genesis 1 to 11 is called the seedbed because it's where all the doctrines that are found later on have their germing point at the beginning, and it grows out of that. We're at the juncture of chapter 11 before going into chapter 12, the life of Abraham. And we see here the last thing in this first part of the book of Genesis, the Tower of Babel. And I want us to look at this morning and see about Babel rising under 4 headings this morning as we look at the text. I want us to see the founder of Babel in chapter 10. We'll backtrack to chapter 10. The foundation of Babel in chapter 11, verses 1 to 4. The failure of Babel in verses 5 to 9. and the future of Babel as well. Because as I say, this is something which will affect our lives today and in the future. So first of all then, the founder of Babel. I heard a story about a farmer who came in to see a restaurant owner in America, and he said, "Could you use 1,000,000 frog legs?" And the restaurant owner said, "Could I?" He said, "That's really, good business food for me. People go crazy for them. If I could have a supply of frog legs, that'd be fantastic." He said, "Well, let's strike a deal." He said, "Starting tomorrow, I'm going to bring you hundreds of frog legs every single week." Well, the next day, the man came to the restaurant, and he was looking a little bit sheepish. And the restaurant owner said, "Well, where are all the frogs?" And the farmer said, "It turns out I was mistaken. You see, there are 2 frogs in my pond, and I thought there was millions of them. But they've been keeping me awake all night, so I made that deal to bring you all those frogs. But they were sure making a lot of noise," he said. But it was only 2 frogs. Now, dear friends, sometimes, it doesn't take many people to disturb the peace, does it? And they can do a big job. And in Genesis chapter 10 and 11, we've had the people coming out of the ark, and the world has been rid of all the evil that's gone on, but it hasn't taken long for people to start turning back to their wicked ways. In chapter 9, we saw about the acts of Canaan and his wickedness towards his grandfather Noah. And here we see about another man, a man called Nimrod. And if you look in chapter 10, verses 8 to 12, we see here the man who is the founder of Babel, and we learn about him. We learn first of all about his roots in verse 8, because it says, "Cush was the father of Nimrod, who grew to be a mighty warrior on the earth." Now his roots are in a man called Cush. And Cush, if you go back up to verse 6, it says, "The sons of Ham, Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan." So he's one of the descendants from the line of Ham. And those of you who were here last week will remember this was the family line that Noah cursed because of the sin of his grandson against him. So he comes from bad stock, if I can put it like that. He comes from a troubled family line in terms of morality and evil, certainly in this story of Genesis. And Cush is an interesting name because we know Cush was the founder of what we would call today Ethiopia. And in the Bible, when it talks about the land of Cush, it's talking about the land of Ethiopia. So Nimrod, the man who planted the Tower of Babel, was an Ethiopian by descent. But there's something more here, and there's something mysterious, because you see, it says in verse 8 about him that he grew to be a mighty warrior on the earth. And the word mighty there is the word which is used in Hebrew for the giants. It's the word that was used earlier on, I believe, for the giants in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. And in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew, it says this: "He was the first on earth to be a giant." And that's interesting, isn't it? So after the flood, when we were told in Genesis chapter 6 that these people were on the earth and also afterwards, who was the first giant? It wasn't Goliath. And it wasn't the sons of Anak in the book of Numbers. It was Nimrod. And so he had a very evil root to him. And he is a man who's described here as a mighty warrior on the earth. In fact, there's an interesting little play on words there, because the word warrior is linked to the word Nimrod. And in fact, it is a word which was used among the Assyrian people who were connected, as we're going to see, with this man. They're his descendants. It was the word for a leopard. Nimr is the word for a leopard. And in the ancient legends about Nimrod, that are Assyrian legends about him. He was a man who hunted with leopards, and he would hunt leopards, and he could hunt with leopards. And he was a very formidable person in this respect. And he didn't just hunt animals. We're going to see he hunted people. He was a very evil and very dangerous man. But because of this business of the leopard skin became connected with Nimrod. And Nimrod, who was the founder of Babel, the first king really after the flood, that's why the family trees of the world, in their royal robes, they have leopard skin on there connected with Nimrod. It's like an acknowledgement to the past of the royalty connection. So that's his roots, as we see there in verse 8. In verse 9, it says about his rebellion, because it says he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. Now, at first you might think to yourself that this is something very good. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. But before the Lord is not a phrase that is used of something positive in the book of Genesis. In fact, it's been used already for something very evil. Back in Genesis chapter 6, it talked about the fact that the evil was being done before God on the face of the earth. And later on in chapter 11, we see it as well. Chapter 19, verse 13, God saw the evil of Sodom and Gomorrah. It had risen up before his face. So chapter 6, verse 11 says this, "Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the ways for all the people on the earth had corrupted their ways." That's how it's translated in the NIV. And it's saying really that this is in God's face. This is defiance. This is rebellion against the Lord. When I was a young Christian, I used to look at Nimrod with admiration. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. And I used to pray I'd be like that. I thank God he never answered my prayers because that wasn't what the Bible meant. It was saying he was defiant against the Lord. And when you think about it, this is defiance, because when the Lord flooded the world, it was because of the giants, but it was also because of the violence in the earth, as we remember back in chapter 6. And afterwards, God set in place new laws for capital punishment to curb manslaughter and violence, didn't he? And murder in the earth, as we saw in the covenant with Noah in Genesis chapter 9. But here, he's a man who says, I don't care about your laws. If I want to kill someone, I'm going to kill them. And he became a defiant, mighty hunter. And it became a proverb that the Jewish people would use for someone who was rebellious. He's like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. And so he was a rebel right down to his core. But even more interesting is as well the fact that in ancient tradition connected with this man is that he becomes the man who masters in the ancient world the bow. Now, we connect the bow with Esau. He's a hunter as well, isn't he? And actually, the bow becomes a weapon associated mostly with Israel's enemies in the Bible, right the way through to the book of Revelation, when a rider appears on a white horse with a bow in his hand, released with the first seal judgment. And he is a man riding a horse with a bow in ancient mythology. And so he is a mighty hunter. Interestingly as well, in the ancient world, he was connected with Orion. Now, this is something you'll find in lots of books like Homer and things like this. And he is connected with Orion. And Orion, if you remember the constellations in the heavens, was the mighty hunter. Now you say, well, I have nothing to do with that. That's all horoscopes. It's not all horoscopes, okay? The constellations were put there by God, not by the devil. Using the stars for astrology is horoscopes. That's of the devil. but the stars are put in heaven by God, and the constellations were God's. And God even talks about this in the book of Job, amongst other places, about the constellations, even mentioning the belt of Orion. Who can tie the belt of Orion? And the belt of Orion is 3 stars in the middle of the belt. I haven't got a picture of it to show you, but they are held together, interestingly enough, by a magnetic field. And scientists now know this, although they didn't know it back in Bible days. But who can hold it together, or who can release it? And there's actually something very fascinating here, that God is giving a little hint about this mighty hunter. Who's the one who can contain him? And who's the one who can release him as well? There's only one powerful enough, and it's God. So he is the mighty hunter before the Lord. He's a rebel before God. But then we see his region in verse 10, because it says the first centers of his kingdom were Babylon, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in Shinar. From that land he went to Assyria, where he built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, and Rezin, which is between Nineveh and Calah. That is the great city. Now, his region is in what we call Mesopotamia. Even though he's from the line of Ham, he settles where the Semitic people are, in the land of Shem. And so those lines become blurred. He is also a person of Ethiopia who's led and settled up in the north and plants a kingdom that is spread out over what we would call Mesopotamia in Bible lands days. But really what we're talking about is Iraq, Iran today. And this is where his kingdom was. Quite a big kingdom that he established in the world in the early days after the flood. And you'll notice the first centers of his kingdom were Babylon. So he is the man who's the founder of Babel. He started this Babel thing that we're going to be looking at in chapter 11. But it wasn't the only one. It was the capital. He went on later on. He had to move out from Babel because of what we see later on. But he built a kingdom in other places. And we're told lots of different names here. Erech. Now, Erech is fascinating because one of the oldest known cities of Mesopotamia is a city called Uruk, U-R-U-K, in English. But it is the transliteration of this ancient word, Erech. And it's where writing was first developed in cuneiform and so on in the ancient world. And we'll come back to that. But it's an interesting thing. Akkad, the Akkadians. Sometimes in your Bible, you will see footnotes that will say, in the Akkadian text, it says this. Akkad was a city, and it was founded by Nimrod. Interestingly, it was destroyed and hasn't yet been rediscovered. But that was according to a curse that we found in archaeology that said this city is gone forever. Then you have Calneh. Now, Calneh is another city which is connected with a Bible city by the same name in Isaiah chapter 10, which is interesting because it's associated again with the Assyrian who will rise up. And so these names were the names of his cities, and of course Nineveh there. And the real thing to take away here is Babylon and Nineveh came from this man. And those were the two great cities in the Old Testament that became world powers, and which behind them with their empires, the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian Empire, were the two cities that came and attacked Israel and Judah. Assyria captured the northern kingdom and took them captive, and the Babylonians came and took the southern kingdom, Judah, captive. So from this man comes the seed of the Old Testament judgments and misery for the Jewish people. You're getting quite a picture about this man, aren't you, as you look at these verses. And because of this, he is called in ancient literature the God of fortresses. You say, wow, why is he called the God of fortresses? Because he would build these fortresses. In fact, all these cities were fortress cities. And some of these cities like Rezin, it means a bridle, a restraint. And it was a fortress on the outskirt, which was to keep the enemies, other people, at bay as they came up against him. And so these are the capitals, the cities that he founded in his kingdom. And he became a king of fortresses. And interestingly enough, in Daniel chapter 11, verse 37 and 38, when the Antichrist comes in the future, he is said to be a man who worships the god of fortresses. He worships Nimrod. And there's a reason why. Because this man is so like the Antichrist who is to come. He also will rebuild Babel. He also will have a kingdom that will be in the so-called New World at that time, and will be very formidable. But this is not all mythology. This is well documented. Some friends gave me a very wonderful book by Titus Kennedy, who's a professor of archaeology, and I was really helped in the preparation of this chapter by this book. And the opening chapter is all about that city, Uruk, and it tells in there about a man who was the priest king of this area and over all these areas. I'd just like to read this to you. It says, representations of the enigmatic priest king or great man, capital G, capital M, of Uruk, have also been found in the Iana precinct and elsewhere on statues, seals, and tablets. The Sumerian term for this person, and by the way, the word Sumeria is not Samaria, like the woman of Samaria in John chapter 4. It's S-U-M, like math sums, Sumeria, and it is the link to the name Shinar. The people of Shinar were the Sumerians. So it says the Sumerian term for this person might be Namestar, and he is depicted as a hunter, master of animals, leader of religious ceremonies, and torturer of prisoners. Evidence from multiple sites in Mesopotamia, such as Gender, Nasser, Tel Ukar, and also suggests that this leader exercised authority over the region, not only Uruk. So it's fascinating to see the archaeology that backs that up as well. So he is the founder of this kingdom. And as I said, one day in the future, there is going to be a man like Nimrod who's going to rise again in the last days. In Isaiah chapter 10, the Antichrist is called the Assyrian because he comes from this root. In Micah chapter 5, the lovely passage we love to read at Christmas about the one who was born at Bethlehem and the Bethlehem prophecy, it goes on to say that that shepherd will stand up and he will defeat the Assyrian. What's that talking about? He's the one who will defeat the Antichrist in the day to come, the Lord Jesus Christ. So we need to be aware of the founder of Babylon and the significance that he has for the rest of history as well. So that's the first thing we see there about it. Second thing we see is the foundation of Babylon back in chapter 11. Now we come to the main text for this morning. And the beginning of Babylon is put here in verses 1 through to 4. And actually what you have in this chapter, in this section I should say, verses 1 to 9, the chapter falls into two halves. The first half is dominated by man, the second half is dominated by the Lord. But the first half, dominated by man, shows the foundation of this city, and it says, now the whole world had one language and a common speech. That's how it was when they came out of the ark. And what was that one language? Scholars believe it was Hebrew because of the roots of the words used in Genesis and their meanings. They only have connection with the word in Hebrew. So, for instance, Adam, back in Genesis chapter 2, is called that because he's made from the earth. Adam is the word for the earth, the soil, the red soil. So the world had one language and a common speech. And the common speech there is probably the fact that they had a dialect that they understood. You know what? I hate to say it, there are people in this country who are English who I cannot understand. If I go up to Newcastle, I can hear Geordies talking, and I speak English, but I don't speak Geordie. You know, and you can relate to other dialects in other places around the country like that. Well, they had one language and a common speech. They could all understand each other. That was the situation at the beginning. Verse 2 says then, as men moved eastward, or from the east, it depends which translation you're using. If you're using the NIV, it's eastward, because they believed that Mount Ararat in Turkey was where the ark was. If you believe the New King James and the King James, it's from the east, which would be from Persia, which would be where the ark landed. But either way, as men moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. And Shinar was the plain in Mesopotamia, which was where Babylon was built. And you remember, even in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, he set up an image in the plain of Babylon. And the word Shinar means literally casting out. And this is what had happened and what was going to happen to the people at this stage. So they settled there. Now, at this point, what you'll see is a spirit of rebellion from Nimrod in the people. And you say, well, no, I don't see that. I don't see what's rebellious. What did they do wrong? Well, if you go back to what happened after the flood, in Genesis chapter 9, verse 1, then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. God told man not to stay together as one group, but to spread out throughout the world and fill the earth. But this group of people, and I believe by this time they had been separated from the Shemites, or at least they had overpowered them, they moved eastward and they settled there as a group together in one language. And this is their desire, is to be a one world entity rather than broken down into separate groups. They are, if you like, a united nations. Verse 3 says, they said to each other, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. You know, if you go to the ancient world, you will find that the buildings in Mesopotamia were first of all made of woven reeds from the Euphrates and the Tigris, but then they were covered in clay from the ground. And the reason for this is that actually in that area there is no stone for building with. And so they had to come up with building materials of their own. And so they started baking bricks out of mud. And this is something which is still done in the Middle East. If you go to Yemen, for instance, you will see whole cities that are made out of mud. I mean, it's staggering to believe, isn't it? In our day and age, there are people living modern lives in houses made of mud. But this is what the Bible said back then, and it's true still in some places today. And they made bricks. But what they found was this. Obviously, mud is okay unless it rains or it gets wet. But they found by heating it, it became as strong as stone and as water resistant. And archaeologists have found mud bricks that have been baked to a temperature of 900 degrees Fahrenheit, according to Titus Kennedy. And they are very strong. I think that's right, Titus Kennedy. It might be someone else, actually. Sorry, thinking about that. But they found very hard-baked bricks which were used for building with. And once they got that, they were away. Now they didn't have to live in primitive buildings. Now they could make elaborate buildings. And so they said, it says here, they used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Well, it's the place where the oil comes from. There's plenty of tar there. And they use that for mortar. And the other benefit of that, of course, is it's waterproof, floodproof. And it says in verse 4, then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth. A second time they say, come, let us do something. And by the way, that phrase is only one good use of that phrase. We're going to come to that in verse 7. But later on, that phrase is used sinfully of people who are planning to do evil. For instance, like Lot's daughters said, come, let us do what we did with our father. And so it's a troublesome phrase. It's a sign of people working as a conspiracy to evil. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower. And Babylon was not only a tower, it wasn't just the Tower of Babel, it was the city of Babel as well. And it was the two together. And the two together were for commerce and for religion. The tower was for religious purposes, a tower that reaches to the heavens. Now, across the Middle East, across Mesopotamia, you will find about 60 ziggurats that are in all the area around where Nimrod was. And a ziggurat looks like a pyramid, but it isn't a pyramid. A pyramid has rooms inside it. A ziggurat doesn't. A ziggurat is basically a mound of earth made up so it will support a stairway, a very big stairway, and it goes up in stages. And the little building you can see at the top is called the Gateway of the Gods. And what it is it's meant to be a tower that reaches to heaven. Not so that people can climb the ladder to get into heaven. They weren't that naive. But so that beings could come down from heaven and come down those steps into their temple at the bottom in the city. And this is why, it's fascinating. You can still see these. As I said, there's about 60. They know there were more in those days. But there's a massive one at Ur, where Abraham was, and they have these steps all the way down. And the so-called gods appeared in the little building at the top and then came out and down. Now, why would they go to all that work and effort to do something if it was just a fable? Remember Genesis 6? The angels came down. As it was before, so it will be afterwards. And this is what they're trying to encourage, a tower that reaches to the heavens. And they're looking to these gods to make them strong and support them so that they may make a name for themselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth. They're looking to them to help them resist the Lord and what he wants. And this is the foundation of Babel in the Bible. It is a work of rebellion against God by bringing unity, of global unity, and looking to demonic power to bring it about. And I have to say, dear friends, this is where it makes it very relevant for you and me, for the world we're living in today as well. Because the world today is looking to sort of go back to Babel. You know, people often say, well, they don't make them like that anymore, do they? Well, in terms of the Tower of Babel, they do. And this is the project in the world today. For instance, the EU Parliament building in Strasbourg, I know I've shown this before and this is old to some of you, is based on a famous painting by an artist called Bruegel. And it's designed to look like the Tower of Babel. Now you say, oh, that's just a coincidence. It's not a coincidence. By the EU's own poster, when that was built, what does it say? Europe, many tongues, one voice. And it has them trying to rebuild the Tower of Babel. This is what's behind the globalism of our day. And Babel has never lost its fascination. I don't know how much we should really worry about this, but fascinating. Amazon are about to build a new massive global headquarters in Washington. And the building, again, is designed on the Tower of Babel. So it's something that's in people's minds. And we have movements in the world today that say what we need, a world falling apart, needs us all coming together to put the world right. We have the World Economic Forum with a program called the Great Reset, which is designed to bring about globalism. We have the UN with something called Agenda 30, which involves using climate change agreements, the UN Migration Pact, the World Health Organization's pandemic treaty, where they say, pandemic, we take over the world. We become the global power. So this is where our world is going. And this is what Babel was. And that's why it's not, this is all relevant history. This is our world today. And it's what the Bible said would happen in the future. Let's move to the third thing, which is the failure of Babel. And we see it in verses 5 to 9. It says in verse 5, "But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the men were building." Now, I love this. They built it for nefarious purposes, but what they got was a visitor they weren't expecting or wanting. The Lord came down. And here from now on, the Lord dominates this passage, and the Lord comes down to see it, the city and the tower that the men were building. And it says, "The Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them." Notice the Lord says this unity, this international unity, is dangerous. It will lead to evil. And that's why God says he's against it. And why he says this has got to be stopped. In verse 7 he says, "Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other." And what the Lord decides to do is to use a non-lethal weapon to break the people up into the nations. He uses their own speech, their own tongue. And whilst they all had been one tongue when they came out the ark, the Lord now gives them different languages. And it's a breakup of the humanity. One person is there with his trowel and his spade ready to put the next brick in place, and he says, "Pass me a brick," and the person next to him doesn't understand him. "You what?" And suddenly they're all talking different languages. You know what happens when a strange phenomena happens like that? People get frightened. Everyone around suddenly speaking different languages. They find somebody else who speaks the same language as them. "Oh, thank goodness, I found somebody else who hasn't gone off their heads." And they group together. "Stay with me so we can find others like us." And by doing that, they spread out in their various people groups. And this is how God dispersed the nations with their languages. Some people say, "Well, I think that's a bit of a fable. It takes a long time to learn a language." Listen, if you're a Christian, you shouldn't be pushed over by things like that, because on the day of Pentecost, and by the way, Pentecost was a reversal of this for the gospel's sake, wasn't it? But on the day of Pentecost, the Lord gave the disciples languages they'd never learned before. So God can do it. And he gave them languages so that they would not understand each other here, verse 7. Verse 8 says, "So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth." And the word Babel is the word that means confused. And it's interesting, isn't it? When Paul went to Athens and they didn't understand what he was preaching, what did they say? "What is this babbler trying to say? What is this babbler trying to say?" It's the word for confusing language we don't understand. A few years ago, there was an exhibition in one of our modern galleries in London. I don't understand modern art, but I understood this one. It was called the Tower of Babel, and it was a stack of radios in the shape of a tower, and they were all tuned in to different radio stations and frequencies. Can you imagine what that would have sounded like? it would have sounded like confusion. Well, that's what God did. And by that means, he brought an end to it. And I want to tell you this, that God will always bring an end to Babel. If you don't believe me, ask Nebuchadnezzar and those of his family line as well. And that's good news, because the Bible tells us about the future of Babel as well. I'd love to tell you that at this point, that's the end of the Tower of Babel and it's all gone and dusted. But actually, the Bible tells us that Babel is going to come back in the future. It's a little bit like those old pictures we used to see of Nessie, the Loch Ness Monster, when we were children, you know, in humps, head sticking out the water, then the body's gone under the water, then it comes up again in an arc, and then it's gone under the water again, then its tail comes up. That's what it's like in the Bible. It appears in Genesis chapter 11, but then it disappears. It comes up again in the days of Daniel, and it's conquered and disappears. But it's going to come up again in the book of Revelation, as we see in the last days. And this is what the Bible prophesies for the future. And I'm not going to take you to these passages now, because that would be another whole Bible study. But make a mental note. Zechariah 5 tells you that a place was prepared at Shinar again for the Tower of Babel, where they would be moved there to that place again. And world economy is going to go back to the Middle East, where it started in those days. And in Genesis chapter 17 and 18, you have the two sides of Babylon, religious Babylon and then economic Babylon, Revelation 18, and God judges both in the days of the tribulation. So that's where the world is going. Friends, there's only one way, and that's the Lord's way. You know, man's way always ends up being broken up. The Lord Jesus said, without me, you can do nothing. And man's attempts to build utopia on earth, or to build his wicked kingdom on earth, will always come to an end. But I want to tell you today, there is another one who's building another city. And in fact, he said, I go to heaven to prepare a place for you. And if you put your trust in him, then you'll be able to go to that city that has a builder and maker who is God, and which will never be destroyed. Well, thank you for listening. I hope that was a help and interest to you. Let's study now.